Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome and thank you for joining us for yet another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, Germany. If you are joining us for the first time, let me introduce you to IRENA and also to our webinar series. We are an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 163 member countries and another 21 countries are in their accession process. We support these countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future, and we serve as a principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Since our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that is why we launched our fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program back in January 2020, before the pandemic drove the proliferation of all the online events. So every other week, presenters from one of IRENA's team share with you key findings from their latest work, offering insights into opportunities and trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. While there are many other longer deep dive webinars out there, here we aim to keep the webinar short. They last approximately 30 minutes, so we cannot cover everything, but the idea is to give you enough to decide whether to delve deeper into the topic. And we signpost in our presentations further sources of information, in-depth information to help you to do that. Next slide, please. So today's webinar will present you the insights from the latest IRENA's report, World Energy Transitions Outlook. Our speakers today are Mr. Riccardo Gordini, Mr. Rodrigo Leme, and Ms. Gayatri Prakash, who are IRENA's analysts and experts. Their presentation will be approximately 20-25 minutes to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. So in 2020, IRENA analyzed a 2-degree scenario and concluding that it implies a 70% CO2 emission reduction in 2050 compared to present levels and compared to policies in place. This year, IRENA analyzed for the first time 1.5-degree scenario in more detail that builds on the deep decarbonization pathway, which was released last year. It implies a 100% CO2 emission reduction in 2050. And our speakers today will share with us key takeaways from the recent 1.5-degree compatible scenario, the role of the energy sector in general. But before I hand over the microphone to our speakers, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is recording and will be available together with the presentation slides on IRENA's webinar website under past webinars. We will share with you the link to the website and also in the follow-up email. And for your information, all previous webinar recordings and slides are already there. All of you are currently muted and you will remain so throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have any questions to our speakers, please send it to us through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speakers. But due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. To be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and also ways to improve it and what else you would like us to cover in future editions, we would appreciate your feedback. So at the end of the webinar and then again in the follow-up email, we will share with you a link to a very short satisfactory survey, which we invite you to complete. We are monitoring all your comments and we work on selecting topics of your interest and trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. And last but not least, if you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Riccardo, Rodrigo, and Gayatri. Riccardo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martina. So welcome, everyone. Really pleasure to have you all here. That's really a very nice topic to discuss. We are all here very, very happy to deliver all these insights and discussions that are related to what is this 1.5C scenario from the International Renewable Energy Agency. It's all about our common future. So please bear with us. It has implications to you directly in your daily lives. It has implications for industries. It has implications for investments, to finance, all innovations, utilities. So it's really a holistic and important aspect that we need to really understand and start to act now. So that's I think is one of the most important message. The action has to start now. We're not really talking about 2050. We're talking about today, tomorrow, the next year, the next 5 years, the next decade, and this is where and when things are going to happen. So really happy, as I said, we need to go as much as possible to electrification, energy efficiency, renewables. So this is a key pillar. Those are the key components of what we understand are the pathways that are there to be followed. Of course, bioenergy has an important role. We are also talking about, as I said, innovation and structural changes. So it's a holistic approach that we need to better understand. And as I said, to take action as much as possible, as soon as possible, especially reducing fossil fuels. Let's start phasing out coal and so on. So having said that, thank you again. I would like to hand over now the floor to Rodrigo. So you will hear from him the energy component related to this pathway. And so thank you very much. The floor is yours, Rodrigo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martina and Ricardo, for the introduction. Next slide, please. Yeah. So as mentioned before, so this is the first time IRENA is addressing a net zero scenario in its global study. So as in our scenario, we call it the 1.5C scenario. As the name implies, the objective here and the main constraint, in fact, in developing this scenario is to make sure that we comply with the carbon budgets that are consistent with keeping the increase in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the source for those carbon budgets in our case is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report 15 that was released, if I'm not mistaken, in 2019 or a couple of years ago. So that's the first boundary condition. So what is the carbon budget we're talking about here? And if you go to that report, to the IPCC report, the first thing you learn is that there's quite a lot of uncertainty around these carbon budgets, okay? It's not like that there is one number. So consulting the report, you might see that the number could be as low as around 100 billion tons of CO2, and it could be as high as close to 1,000 billion tons of CO2. So for this report, we picked the number 500 billion tons of CO2. So that's a quite reasonable carbon budget, and one that is consistent with a 50% chance of remaining below 1.5 C. So that's the first boundary condition for this scenario. The second one is that emissions need to be brought to net zero by 2050. Okay, so those are the two main boundary conditions that led us in developing this scenario. Now, as you probably are aware, the way the world is running today is not really in compliance with those two boundary conditions. And if you look in this chart, the top line there on this chart roughly represents what would be the current trajectory of emissions if things remain as they are. And that is clearly leading us to well above 1,000 billion tons of CO2. Okay, so more than double the carbon budget we considered. Now, if we consider now the plans and policies that are on the table as of 2019, 2020, then that would flatten out emissions throughout 2050, but would still put us well above the 500 billion tons. That would take us to around 1,000 billion tons, okay? So the effort that we need is really huge, as you can see there, and that's the blue line. That's what we believe should be achieved to stay below 100 billion tons, okay? So that's our 1.5C scenario. So the effort is shared amongst all sectors in the energy system. You can see there transport, buildings, but mainly power generation, electricity generation, and the industry sector need to provide their larger share of contribution in this mitigation effort. Another important aspect here is that the action needs to start very soon, or now, if you prefer, so that we can reach this carbon budget. Okay, so in the first 10 years, the next decade is truly fundamental in that regard. And last on this slide, what I would like to comment is that our 1.5C scenario is a normative scenario. So in that sense, it's not a forecast. It's not what we believe is going to happen, but rather what we believe should happen. And it states our preferences in terms of the solutions that are needed to achieve this carbon budget. So, and then with that, I would move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so there are potentially tens or hundreds of scenarios that would be compliant with that carbon budget. Some scenarios might prefer CCS, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear. Other scenarios might emphasize radical shifts in lifestyle. IRENA scenario emphasizes technology innovation, and technology innovation in the areas of renewable energy, energy conservation and energy efficiency, and electrification of end-use sector. So these three are the key pillars, the key components of our mitigation effort in this 1.5C scenario. So they deliver between them over 70% of emissions reductions. And if you add to that what we call indirect electrification, which is hydrogen that you see there, the 10%, so then we're talking about 80 or even 90% of the emissions reductions, okay? There is a final component that is essential as well, because even doing all energy efficiency, renewables, and electrification, direct and indirect, there are still emissions left to be abated. And that's when we rely to some carbon capture and storage, CCS, carbon capture and utilization, CCU, and more importantly, bioenergy associated with carbon capture and storage, BECCS. Okay. And then again, in BECCS, renewable energy in the form of bioenergy is another essential component of the mitigation effort. So all in all, if we exclude from that chart there the 6% from CCS and CCU that is related to fossil fuels and process emissions, over almost 90% of all decarbonization in 2050 would involve renewable energy and energy efficiency. Okay, so next slide, please. And obviously, this has profound implications on the energy system, and the focus of our report is the energy system. Here, for instance, we can see the chart showing total primary energy supply. So on the left-hand side is the situation in 2018. So abusing a bit the language, the situation today, let's say, it's around 600 exajoules per year that the world needs in terms of primary supply of energy. If we follow the planned energy scenario, that number would grow to close to 800 exajoules in 2050. And only 23% of that energy would be coming from renewable sources. Okay. Now, in our 1.5C scenario, that number would remain relatively flat. So basically in 2050, we would need the same 600 exajoules, but still would be serving and catering for a global population that is 2 billion larger, 7 to 9 billion growing, and also economies that are also bigger and hopefully wealthier, especially the countries that need to develop economically. So implied in this stabilization of primary energy supply is energy efficiency and energy conservation, but also a huge increase in renewable energy needs from 14% today to 74% in 2050. So that's an eightfold growth in the pace of renewable share, in the pace of growth of renewable energy share. and also a 2.5-fold increase in the rate of energy intensity, so implicitly energy efficiency there. Next slide, please. Now, if we look in terms of the final energy consumption, and this chart has a lot of information to unpack, we can see that final energy declines in the 1.5C scenario that we propose, right? From 378 exajoules in 2018, it goes down to 348 in 2050. And again, we're still considering the same level of service broadly, so but a higher population and more economic growth, right? And the main takeaways from this chart are, first, you can see that the role of fossil fuels in energy consumption, in final energy consumption, is diminished significantly. From, you can see on the left hand is 30, 40, 50, over 60, 70% of energy consumption. And it must come down to roughly 10% in 2050. Now, one of the most stark changes there is the growth of electricity, the role of electricity in final energy consumption. So it grows from 21% to 51%. In 2018, only 25% of that electricity was coming from renewable energy sources. In 2050, the number would have to go to 90% if we are to comply with the 1.5C goal. Nuclear remains relatively flat in this period. And in terms of fossil fuels, only natural gas remains relevant in electricity generation. So electrification is a very key component of this scenario. The other two key components are modern biomass. It will be extremely difficult to make it happen without modern biomass. And modern biomass, as I mentioned before, also helps us with negative emissions in the form of BECCS, but also hydrogen. So hydrogen and its derivatives, things like methanol and ammonia, and other hydrogen-based fuels. So those are also very relevant, and they act as an indirect form of electrification. So roughly what we consider in our scenario is that 66% or 2/3 of the hydrogen would be produced from renewable electricity, so-called green hydrogen. And there would still be 1/3 being produced from natural gas coupled with CCS, so-called blue hydrogen. So 51% from direct electricity plus 12% or 2/3 of 12%, that's 7% of green hydrogen. That puts electricity at 58% basically in terms of final energy consumption, 58% of the final energy consumption. That's the importance of electricity in this scenario. Apart from that, in this chart, I think I covered most of, yeah, that's right. Okay, next slide, please. Obviously, you can see more details of this in the full report. We don't want to get you bogged down into many details here. So in this chart, we can see more detail what happens to fossil fuels. Obviously, there is a massive decline in fossil fuels from roughly 500 exajoules today, this primary supply, to close to 100 in 2050. So basically, you can see on the bottom of the bars, coal all but disappears from the energy system. Oil also declines significantly. Well, as you might be aware, coal is the main use of coal today is for electricity generation. And as electricity becomes renewable, coal goes away. Oil, the main use for oil is in road transport. Again, as transport is electrified through electric vehicles, electric trucks, and so on, the importance of oil is diminished significantly. And natural gas, although it declines, it doesn't decline so much, and it remains as an important component of the energy mix, but it shifts significantly its role. So it remains important in electricity generation because it's important to have some source of grid flexibility for variable renewable sources. But then it also becomes relevant in the hydrogen, like I explained before. Part of the hydrogen will be produced using natural gas with CCS, so the blue hydrogen. So these two uses of natural gas make up almost 70% of the use of natural gas in this 2050 scenario. The remainder is mainly in industry and used as fuel and as well as feedstock. And with that, I think the next slide, please. I think I hand over to Gayatri. Yeah. Okay, I'll hand over to Gayatri now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Rodrigo. So I would like to focus more on the economic side of the transformation, presenting more insights on the investments. So as we can see here, the investments under two scenarios, which is basically the one which is under the current plans and policies, and the one that needs to happen in order to realize the 1.5C climate future. So the government plans in place today call for almost investing close to 98 trillion in the energy sector over the next 30 years. So far, the major economies have announced different economic packages that will pump almost 4.6 trillion into the recovery packages, more focusing on those sectors that are emitting. But only 40% of those investments are really green investments. So our outlook, IRENA's outlook, shows global investments must be redirected to low carbon solutions and significantly scaled up. So in our scenario, IRENA's 1.5 scenario, we could achieve a much resilient and sustainable future with an additional $33 trillion over the next 30 years compared to the planned investments. In total, we would need around over 130 trillion of energy sector investments over the next 30 years. If we move to the next slide, so over So over 80% of the investments are needed in terms of energy transition technologies. So by energy transition technologies, I mean those technologies excluding fossil fuels and nuclear. So here we are talking about renewables, energy efficiency measures, end-use electrification measures, such as electric vehicles and heat pumps, for instance, power grids and associated other infrastructure, and other flexibility solutions to integrate rising shares of renewables, variable renewables. And this also means that almost 24 trillion of planned investments focusing more on fossil fuels and other nuclear technologies needs to be redirected towards energy transition technologies. Overall, compared to the planned scenario, we estimate around 1.1 trillion of additional energy sector investments would be needed in the next 3 decades. In addition to these investments, of course, we do have additional investments that are foreseen towards research and development, equipment supply, and also other investments that are needed for skill enhancements and training programs. So if we move to the next slide. So the previous slide. Innovation is the key. Can we move to, Innovation is the key in order to realize such a massive transformation. And innovation will help towards the energy transition process and decarbonizing the energy sector. Here, it's not just an innovation at the technology level, and we do see that an integrated innovation or more holistic view is needed across different dimensions. So driven by innovation and economies of scale, renewable power generation sources are already economically attractive in many regions. Therefore, special attention would be needed for other emerging technologies such as green hydrogen. So if we move to the next slide, beyond IRENA's 1.5 scenario, several other scenarios have been published, which shows a clear view on the energy transition pathways. The energy scenarios examined here in this particular slide shows indeed different visions of the future. There is a significant difference between achieving the 1.5 climate versus net zero. However, all scenarios do propose higher renewables share in the primary energy supply mix, which is represented in the y-axis, with nearly half of them almost having a lower primary supply, which indicates a greater efficiency improvements in the overall energy mix. While carbon emissions in the sector must be drastically reduced in order to achieve the climate goals, Achieving the net zero target would require extending beyond technology, however, also requiring some structural and lifestyle changes. Moving to next slide. To summarize, we do see the proven technologies for a net zero energy system already exist. As Rodrigo already mentioned, renewable power, green hydrogen, and modern bioenergy will dominate the world of future energy system. As shown, the pathway is extremely challenging, but it wouldn't be easy yet achievable if we act now and faster. So fundamentally, energy transition is not just a vehicle for decarbonization, but also for a new evolution of a new economy that's inclusive, prosperous, and resilient. IRENA's outlook shows that we need highest level of commitment and ambition in order to realize such a transformation along with international collaboration. Together, we can create a prosperous world. The preview will be followed by full report outlining other extended views on the technology insights along with the socioeconomic footprint for the transition. With this, I would hand over for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, Rodrigo, and Gayatri. A lot of insights unpacked here. So lowering emissions, as you say, in the face of carbon budget constraints will really require a large portfolio of solutions, and we need to also accelerate the pace. So we have received quite a few questions from the audience. They are not necessarily connected, so I will be taking them one by one and try to rotate with our speakers. So I will start with one for probably Ricardo. So fossil fuels were mentioned as still remaining in 2050. Can you a little bit elaborate on what needs to be done on the side of oil and gas companies to accelerate the energy transition and their contribution to it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question because, as I said before, the implications are there and the impact and actions are needed soon, right? So as we saw, the pathway and the energy mix is changing towards a renewable energy mix together with energy efficiency, and electrification is very important. So the role of fossil fuel is decreasing, and then the question, is what to do, right? So oil companies, they are really looking at the future and thinking, well, what's needed, right? What should I do? What can I change in my strategy? So here in IRENA, we have been looking at this as well. So basically, when we look at the opportunities that are there in this scenario, it's trillions, as Gayatri presented, but it's interesting to understand that energy companies that are working in oil and gas, for instance, they can take their expertise, their skills, their competencies, and shift to invest in another set of portfolio renewables. So basically, we're talking here about the usual bioenergy. So a lot of companies are already working on that area. So they could expand that. Why not? There are a lot of expertise in offshore. So why don't increase this investment in offshore renewable solutions? We mentioned a lot of hydrogen. So they all know as well the hydrogen production, and that's also a possible combination, investing in innovation together with CCS. So I think it's important for those companies to look at this scenario and search for the opportunities that are there to set a new strategy for their business models. So that's the main message. Thank you, Martina. Back to you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Maybe a short question, I don't know the answer, to Rodrigo. What do you mean by modern biomass? That's the question. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So in energy analysis jargon, perhaps I should say, there are two types of biomass or bioenergy. So traditional bioenergy, biomass, and modern biomass. And we normally use that to differentiate between what is traditional biomass, so from the modern use. So traditional biomass is normally what happens in developing countries, where people need to go in the bush, collect wood, cow dung, and other biomass residues, normally to use that as fuel for cooking. So that's a huge problem in many parts of the world, from Asia to Africa and Latin America. So that's undesirable for many reasons, and that must change. So that's traditional biomass. So modern biomass, as opposed to that, are all the bioenergy applications where, first of all, biomass is sourced responsibly and sustainably, right? So you ensure that the whole bioenergy production chain enforces environmental and social standards and criteria, and also delivers energy services that are, consistent with the energy transition, right? Without increasing emissions, without generating impacts in the environment and in people's livelihood. So examples of modern biomass would be charcoal for cooking. So you can still cook with biomass, but then not with cow dung or wood collected from the bush, but rather with, say, charcoal or pellets. Another example would be liquid biofuels in transport, advanced biofuels, biojet fuels. And perhaps a third example would be biogas and biomethane, to talk about solid, liquid, and gaseous bioenergy. Back to you, thanks.
Thank you. One for Gayatri. Would you say that technological innovation and solutions can provide a sufficient solution towards achieving net zero targets? Thank you.
Sure, I think yes, that's the key message from our side. We do emphasize innovation or technology enhancements, prioritizing these technologies that we already listed. And so innovation as such is not just technology. So we do strongly believe holistic innovation is needed across different areas. So innovation as such in technology is happening and needs to be accelerated, but innovations needs to be extended for other aspects, as I said, maybe in terms of how we handle materials, how to improve the way we produce things, and more on the circular economy practices, or more along the sides of market design, regulations. So for us, innovation as such is technology. It plays a key role, but beyond technology, it needs to be an integrated innovation to really realize this transition.
Thank you, Gayatri. We'll take one round of questions, so one question each, and then we will wrap up. So one for Ricardo. Do we already have the technology we need to achieve this scenario? What are the main areas that need developing? Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Yeah, this is also a very good question. So we mentioned that there are technologies already available. So the energy efficiency, electrification component, together with all this bioenergy that Rodrigo mentioned, those are really important aspects that we need to focus. And to deliver that in each sector, if you look at buildings, if you look at industry, if you look at transport, basically the technologies are there, right? So there are some in different size of or maturity, if you like, but the technologies are available. So most of the changes that we provide here in terms of solutions are coming with technology that are already there and are developing in terms of maturity. So we can name the electric vehicles in transport in general, the electrification in general of transport. You can mention the bioenergy solutions that are available for, let's say, heating in industry, and solutions that are available for that. And also in terms of buildings, so we have solutions for heating as well, electricity related, like heat pumps. So basically we're talking about solutions already there. Yes, there are important aspects, so especially in sectors that are hard to decarbonize, that we need to enhance and improve. So in this case, the holistic innovation, as Gayatri mentioned, is very important, as well technologies to be further improved. But this is something, it's already happening. There are a lot of research and investments on that side. and we are confident that this is also going to be competitive soon. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions of a similar nature. So for Rodrigo, given the global climate emergency, setting goals for the year 2020 may be too lax. Wouldn't it be better to set the goals for 2030? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in the report, I mean, obviously what you have access now is the preview to the report. So if you go online, you're going to find the preview to the report. The full report will be launched, I think in June, if I'm not mistaken. So there's going to be far more detail in terms of the more shorter term goals. And yes, absolutely. Looking too far in the future is not very helpful. It just helps us perhaps to steer the boat, but the action really needs to start now. And if we don't have short-term goals, it's easy to miss the target because we shouldn't underestimate the challenges involved in realizing this scenario. It's very, very difficult, very difficult. And yet we have to look in the next years to make sure that it happens, or the way it will go, right?
Thank you. And we will close, we are a little bit running over time, but we will close with this question for Gayatri. So does the World Energy Transition Outlook propose any significant energy transition solution that utilize ocean waves? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Yeah, indeed, we do see ocean, of course, contains vast renewable potential, almost equivalent to more than double current electricity demand. So, of course, we do consider ocean and technologies as one of the key solutions to decarbonize the power sector. And I would say it's one of the technology where we also emphasize innovation or technology development that needs to happen in forthcoming decade for scaling up the deployments from 2030 onwards. So in our scenario, we do see a prominent role for ocean technologies in the longer run. And I want to mention a particular report that was launched by IRENA last year, which is an innovation outlook focusing more on ocean energy technologies that kind of discusses the current status, challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for ocean technologies in the energy transition. So highly encouraged to go and check the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time. So let me thank again our speakers, Mr. Ricardo Gordini, Mr. Rodrigo Leme, and Ms. Gayatri Prakash for sharing with us key takeaways from their latest analysis of 1.5 degrees scenario. And equally, thank you all for listening, for all your questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't answer all of them, and mostly for joining us today. We want to leave you with final announcements. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will share with you a link to a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar. And then again, the link will be shared with you in the follow-up email. And we thank you in advance for completing the survey. And we are lining up several other webinars, which we will be posting on our website in the coming days. So please stay tuned. And that is all from us for today. So once again, thank you to our speakers and all of you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next editions of webinars. Goodbye and see you soon.